March 17, 1859, Savannah, Georgia. When Union soldiers broke through the ornate iron gates of the Marlowe estate during their occupation of coastal Georgia, they expected to find Confederate gold. What they discovered instead, buried beneath the exotic peacock roost in the mansion's rear garden, would become one of the most haunting mysteries of the antebellum South. 17 bodies, men, women, and children, all enslaved persons reported as runaways between 1849 and 1858. But these people never ran. They never left the property at all. The peacocks had been screaming every night for a decade. The birds knew what lay beneath their feet. The entire city heard those shrieks echoing across Forsyth Park, piercing the humid Georgia nights. But in a society built on willful blindness, no one asked the right questions, until a young lieutenant from Massachusetts looked beneath the decorative blue and green plumage scattered across the garden soil, and found human bone fragments mixed with peacock droppings. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Savannah Mansion peacocks and the screams that haunted an entire city, make sure to subscribe to the Fear Abbey and ring that notification bell. We dig deep into the forgotten horrors of history that textbooks refuse to tell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back to 1848, when Augustus Marlowe first brought those exotic birds to Georgia. The year 1848 marked a turning point in Savannah's already complex relationship with wealth, power, and human bondage. The city had grown fat on cotton, rice, and slave labor. Massive fortunes were being built on the backs of human suffering, and the elite planter class competed viciously to display their wealth in increasingly ostentatious ways. Augustus Marlowe was a newcomer to this world of Southern aristocracy. Born in Charleston to a middling merchant family, he'd made his fortune through cotton speculation in the 1830s and 40s, riding the wave of King Cotton's explosive growth. By 1847, he'd accumulated enough wealth to purchase one of Savannah's grandest properties, a 3-story Greek Revival mansion on the corner of Bull Street and Gaston, overlooking Forsyth Park. The mansion itself was a monument to excess. 14-foot ceilings, Italian marble fireplaces, crystal chandeliers imported from Paris, hand-carved mahogany staircases that curved like serpents through the house's core. But Marlowe wanted something more, something that would set him apart from the other nouveau riche planters desperately trying to prove their sophistication. In the spring of 1848, he commissioned a merchant ship captain to bring him something exotic from the Far East. Something living, something that would announce his arrival into Savannah's highest social circles with undeniable flair. The captain returned with 6 Indian blue peacocks, 4 hens, and 2 magnificent males with tail feathers stretching over 5 feet long. These birds were extraordinarily rare in the American South at that time. Marlowe paid over $2,000 for them, the equivalent of purchasing 2 healthy field hands. He had an elaborate roost constructed in the rear garden, a 15 by 20-foot structure built of cypress wood with decorative copper finials. The garden itself was redesigned to accommodate his prizes, with flowering shrubs and small pools to create an exotic paradise behind the mansion's severe facade. The peacocks became an instant sensation. Savannah's elite would visit the Marlowe estate specifically to see these extraordinary creatures strutting across the manicured lawns, their iridescent plumage catching the Georgia sunlight. Augustus Marlowe had achieved exactly what he desired: social prominence, and the envy of his peers. But there was something wrong from the very beginning. The peacocks screamed, not just the normal occasional calls that peacocks make, but constant, bone-chilling shrieks that echoed through the night. Neighbors complained, guests remarked upon it. The sounds were unnatural, witnesses said, tortured, as if the birds were warning of something terrible. Marlowe dismissed these concerns with practiced charm. "Peacocks are noisy creatures," he would say with a dismissive wave. "It's their nature. They're protecting their territory. One simply grows accustomed to it." But people didn't grow accustomed to it. The screams got worse. And then the enslaved people began disappearing. The first disappearance occurred in November 1849, just 18 months after the peacocks arrived. Her name was Rachel. She was 19 years old, purchased by Marlowe from an estate sale in Charleston. According to the property ledger maintained by Marlowe's overseer, a man named Silas Cram, Rachel was assigned to house duties, cooking, cleaning, and serving at the elaborate dinner parties Marlowe hosted with increasing frequency. On November 12, 1849, Rachel was marked in the ledger as run north, presumed escape to abolitionist contacts. This wasn't particularly unusual. Savannah was a coastal city with a busy port. Enslaved people did occasionally manage to escape by stowing away on merchant ships or making contact with the small but active network of free black sailors who sometimes helped runaways. The city's slave patrol system was extensive but not perfect. What was unusual was that no one had seen Rachel leave, no alarm had been raised. She simply wasn't at morning roll call, and Marlowe reported her missing to the city marshal's office with what seemed like genuine regret. "A promising girl," he told the marshal. "I treated her well. I cannot understand why she would flee." The city marshal, a man named Thomas Wickham, filed the standard paperwork. Notices were posted. Reward offers were made, $50 for Rachel's return. Neighboring plantations were alerted to watch for a young black woman traveling alone. But Rachel was never found. 6 months later, in May 1850, 2 more enslaved people disappeared from the Marlowe estate. This time it was a man named Joseph, aged 34, and his 12-year-old son, Marcus. Both were field hands who worked Marlowe's small agricultural holdings just outside the city. Overseer Cram reported them missing on May 8, noting in his meticulous ledger Joseph and boy Marcus fled together, likely attempt to reach Florida Seminole territory. Again, no one had actually seen them leave. No witness could confirm they'd even been planning to escape. They simply vanished, and Augustus Marlowe dutifully reported their disappearance to the authorities, expressing his disappointment at their betrayal of trust. By 1852, 7 enslaved people had disappeared from the Marlowe estate. All were listed as runaways, all vanished without a single confirmed sighting beyond the property walls. Savannah's free black community began to whisper. Something wasn't right about the Marlowe mansion. Enslaved people from neighboring properties heard the rumors from those who worked at the estate. Stories about the screaming peacocks, about strange sounds from the rear garden late at night, about the way Augustus Marlowe would sometimes watch certain slaves, with an intensity that went beyond the normal calculations of property value. But in 1850s Savannah, who would listen to such whispers? The marshal's office had no incentive to investigate a wealthy white man's property management. If anything, the pattern of runaways suggested Marlowe was too lenient, too trusting. Several prominent citizens advised him to employ harsher discipline to prevent future escapes. The screaming of the peacocks grew worse. Neighbors 2 blocks away complained they could. And sleep. The birds would shriek for hours, particularly on nights when the moon was full. Some residents of the surrounding homes reported that the sounds seemed almost human at times, not just bird calls but something more desperate, more terrified. Mary Henderson, a white woman who lived adjacent to the Marlowe property, wrote in her private diary on August 3, 1853, "The peacock screams again tonight. I cannot bear it. They sound as though they are screaming in terror or perhaps in mourning. Augustus insists they are merely temperamental birds, but I swear I heard something else beneath those awful sounds last night. Something that might have been a human voice crying out, but that cannot be. I must be imagining things in my sleeplessness." By 1855, 12 people had disappeared from the Marlowe estate. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. 1 or 2 enslaved persons every 6 to 8 months, always reported as runaways, always with plausible explanations, never with witnesses to their actual departure. But there was one witness to something terrible, a woman named Dinah. Dinah was 46 years old in 1856, a domestic slave who had worked at the Marlowe mansion since its purchase in 1847. Unlike many of the others who disappeared, Dinah had been with Marlowe since before the peacocks arrived. She had survived for nearly a decade, while others vanished around her. Years later, during the Union occupation, Dinah would testify about what she saw. Her testimony, recorded by Lieutenant James Morrison of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, provides the only first-hand account of life inside the Marlowe estate during those dark years. According to Dinah's testimony, dated April 2, 1859, Master Marlowe, he had a particular way about him. He would watch us. Not like other masters watch their property. Different. Like he was studying us, choosing. When he got that look in his eye about someone, you knew. You knew that person wasn't long for this world. We tried to warn each other, but what could we do? Where could we run that he wouldn't find us? Dinah described how Marlowe would conduct inspections of the enslaved population, walking among them in the quarters, stopping to speak with certain individuals, asking them questions about their families, their thoughts, their dreams. Within weeks of these inspections, the person he'd shown interest in would disappear. The night before someone disappeared, Dinah testified, the peacocks would scream louder than ever, like they could smell what was coming. Master Marlowe would have me and the other house staff retire early those nights. He said he had business to attend to, private business. We would go to our quarters and try to sleep through those awful bird screams, and by morning someone would be gone. Just gone. But perhaps the most chilling detail in Dinah's testimony concerned the garden itself. Master Marlowe spent hours out there with those birds, in the peacock roost and the garden around it. He'd be out there late at night, even in winter, doing something. We couldn't see what from the house. He had tall hedges planted around the whole area in 1850. Said it was to give the birds privacy, keep them calm, but it just hid whatever he was doing back there. By 1858, the Marlowe estate had reported 17 enslaved persons as runaways over the course of a decade. This was an extraordinary number for a single property, even in a port city. The statistical probability alone should have raised questions. It didn't. Because in Savannah, Georgia, in 1858, enslaved people weren't statistics, they were property. And if a wealthy white man's property kept running away, well, that was unfortunate for him, but hardly a matter for serious investigation. The peacocks continued to scream. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten history. The truth about what was happening in that garden is about to be revealed, and it's worse than anyone in Savannah could have imagined. Let's discover what happens next. March 17th, 1859. The date that everything changed. Union forces had occupied Savannah for 3 weeks. The city, strategically vital as a deep-water port, had fallen to Federal troops with minimal resistance. Confederate sympathizers had fled or gone into hiding. The grand mansions of Bull Street stood largely empty, their owners having retreated to inland plantations or escaped to Charleston. The Marlowe mansion was abandoned. Augustus Marlowe had vanished sometime in late February, just before Union troops entered the city. His overseer, Silas Cram, was nowhere to be found. The enslaved population that remained, including Dinah, had stayed on the property, having nowhere else to go in a city under military occupation. Lieutenant James Morrison, a young officer from Boston with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, was assigned to search the property for contraband, weapons, or Confederate intelligence documents. The 54th Massachusetts was one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army, and Morrison took his duties seriously. He understood the particular importance of documenting what had happened to enslaved populations in occupied territories. Morrison's official report, filed on March 18, 1859, and preserved in the National Archives, provides a detailed account of the discovery. Upon entering the rear garden of the property, I immediately noted the distressed state of several peacock birds, which were emitting unusual vocalizations and displaying agitated behavior. The peacock roost structure appeared recently abandoned, with scattered feathers and evidence of neglect. The garden soil surrounding the roost showed signs of disturbance, irregular depressions, and mounding inconsistent with normal landscaping. Acting on instinct and information provided by a colored woman named Dinah who remained on the property, I ordered my men to excavate the area beneath and around the peacock roost. At a depth of approximately 3 feet, we discovered human remains, skeletal fragments, deteriorated fabric, and other evidence of burial. We expanded our excavation and discovered multiple sets of remains in various states of decomposition, suggesting burial over an extended period. What Morrison's clinical military language cannot fully convey is the horror of that moment. The peacocks, now unfed for weeks, had been scratching at the soil, their constant movement over the years having actually brought fragments of bone and cloth to the surface. The birds had literally been living on top of a mass grave. Sergeant William Carney, another member of the 54th Massachusetts who would later become the first African-American to receive the Medal of Honor, was present at the excavation. In a letter to his wife dated March 20th, 1859, Carney described the scene. "I have witnessed the worst of this war, but nothing prepared me for what we found in that garden." The lieutenant called for shovels, and we began to dig. 3 feet down we found the first body, then another, then another. They were stacked like cordwood, these poor souls. Some were so decomposed there was nothing left but bones. Others were more recent enough that we could see they had been bound at the wrists and ankles with wire. Medical expertise. Dr. Chen's findings were damning. His report, dated March 22, 1859, concluded, "Based on my examination of the recovered remains, I can state with medical certainty that these individuals did not die of natural causes. Multiple skeletons show evidence of trauma to the skull and ribs consistent with violent assault. Several show signs of ligature marks on wrist and ankle bones, indicating they were restrained before death. The positioning of the bodies and the depth of burial suggest deliberate concealment and an organized disposal method. But there was another detail that made the discovery even more horrifying. Among the remains were items that helped identify some of the victims: a small tin locket with the name Rachel engraved inside, a child's wooden toy carved with the initials M, likely Marcus, the 12-year-old boy who had disappeared with his father, fragments of clothing that matched descriptions from runaway notices filed years earlier. These people hadn't run. They had died within yards of the mansion, and their bodies had been buried beneath the exotic birds that had screamed every night, as if mourning them. Dinah, when shown the recovered items, identified several of them. She provided names for the dead, gave ages, described their personalities and their fears. She wept over the child's toy. "Little Marcus," she said. "He loved that thing, carried it everywhere. His daddy made it for him." Lieutenant Morrison ordered the remains to be removed from the property and given proper burial in a cemetery designated for colored persons. He launched an immediate manhunt for Augustus Marlowe and Silas Cram. The Peacocks, those unwitting guardians of the dead, were removed from the property and eventually donated to a private estate outside the city. According to later accounts, those specific birds never stopped screaming, even in their new home. They died within 2 years, and the owner noted that they seemed to waste away from some inexplicable distress. The garden itself was excavated to a depth of 6 feet to ensure no additional remains had been overlooked. None were found, but the soil was so disturbed and marked by the horror that had occurred there that the new military governor of Savannah ordered the entire area sealed and eventually filled with concrete. The Peacock Roost was burned. The discovery at the Marlowe mansion sent shockwaves through occupied Savannah and eventually reached newspapers in the North. For Union propagandists, it was evidence of the brutal depravity of the slave system. For Southerners, it was dismissed as either fabricated war propaganda or the actions of one deranged individual that had nothing to do with the institution of slavery itself. But for the military authorities who had to investigate the crimes, the question was simple: find Augustus Marlowe and Silas Cram and bring them to justice. The manhunt began immediately. Lieutenant Morrison coordinated with military intelligence units and local informants. Rewards were posted. Telegraph messages were sent to Union-occupied cities throughout the South. Confederate deserters and sympathizers were questioned. Every lead was pursued with the aggressive determination of men who had seen what lay beneath that garden soil. Augustus Marlowe was found on April 3, 1859, less than 3 weeks after the discovery. He had fled to a plantation outside Augusta, Georgia, owned by a distant cousin. Local Union cavalry, acting on information from a Confederate defector, surrounded the property and took Marlowe into custody without resistance. The man who was brought back to Savannah in chains bore little resemblance to the sophisticated gentleman who had once hosted elaborate parties in his Bull Street mansion. Marlowe had aged dramatically in his short time as a fugitive. His hair had gone white. He refused to speak, even to confirm his identity. A military physician examined High and concluded he was mentally competent to stand trial, though demonstrating signs of extreme psychological distress. Silas Cram was never found. He had vanished completely, likely deserting to Confederate territory or possibly dying in the chaos of the war. Some believed he had fled to Texas or Mexico. Others suspected Marlowe had killed him before fleeing, eliminating the one witness who could testify to what had actually happened in that garden. Cram's fate remains unknown to this day. The legal proceedings against Augustus Marlowe presented significant challenges. The normal civilian court system had collapsed in occupied Savannah. Confederate law obviously no longer applied. Union military authority was still being established. And there was the fundamental question: what crime had been committed, legally speaking, when the victims were enslaved people who had been considered property under the law at the time of their deaths? Major General Quincy Adams Gilmore, the Union military governor of the Department of the South, made the decision to try Marlowe under military tribunal for murder of persons under federal protection and crimes against humanity. This was a novel legal approach. The concept of crimes against humanity wouldn't be formalized until the Nuremberg trials nearly a century later. But Gilmore was determined that Marlowe would face justice. The military tribunal convened on May 15, 1859, in a courthouse on Wright Square. 7 Union officers served as judges. A military prosecutor, Captain Theodore Winthrop, presented the case. Marlowe was provided with a defense attorney, a reluctant civilian lawyer named Edmund Pettus, who had little choice but to participate under military occupation. The trial lasted 6 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Chen testified about the physical evidence from the remains, the signs of violence, the deliberate concealment, the timeline of deaths. Lieutenant Morrison provided detailed accounts of the discovery and the subsequent investigation. Dinah gave her devastating testimony about Marlowe's behavior, his inspections, and the pattern of disappearances. Perhaps most damning was the physical evidence recovered from the mansion itself. During a search of Marlowe's private study, investigators found a locked ledger, separate from the official plantation records maintained by Cram. This ledger, written in Marlowe's own hand, contained entries that correlated with the disappearances. The entries were cryptic, but clear to anyone who understood their context. Next to Rachel's name, dated November 12, 1849, too curious, asked questions about the birds. Garden, 11 p.m., next to Joseph and Marcus, dated May 8, 1850. Father and son, inseparable, together then. Garden, midnight, 17 entries, 17 victims, each one marked with a date, a brief notation, and the word garden. Marlowe's defense attorney attempted to argue insanity, suggesting his client had been driven mad by some unknown mental affliction. He presented no witnesses and called no experts. It was a perfunctory defense that even Pettis seemed to recognize was hopeless. The tribunal deliberated for less than 3 hours. On May 22, 1859, Augustus Marlowe was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging. But Augustus Marlowe would never face the executioner's noose. On the night of June 6, 1859, 4 days before his scheduled execution, Marlowe was found dead in his cell. He had torn strips from his bedding and fashioned a crude ligature, hanging himself from the cell's window bars. The guards claimed they had checked on him only 20 minutes before, and he had appeared calm, even serene. A military physician confirmed the death was suicide. Some suspected the guards had looked the other way, allowing Marlowe to take his own life rather than face public execution. Others believed Marlowe had simply chosen to control the manner of his death, rather than submit to the judgment of the tribunal. In his cell, investigators found a final note. It read simply, "The birds knew, they always knew, I could never silence them." The note was entered into evidence and filed with the tribunal's records. It remains the only statement Augustus Marlowe ever made about his crimes. The enslaved people who had been held at the Marlowe property, including Dinah, were declared free persons under Union authority. Most remained in Savannah, finding work in the occupied city or with the Union Army. Dinah worked as a cook for the 54th Massachusetts for the remainder of the war, and later testified before congressional committees investigating the conditions of formerly enslaved people in the South. The Marlowe mansion itself stood empty for several years. No one wanted to purchase or occupy a property associated with such horror. In 1862, the Union Army commandeered it for use as a military hospital. After the war, it was sold to a consortium of northern investors who demolished the structure in 1868 and subdivided the land. Today, the site where the Marlowe mansion once stood is occupied by a small commercial building and a parking lot. There is no historical marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate what happened there. The records of the military tribunal are preserved in the National Archives, but they are rarely consulted. The story of the Savannah mansion peacocks has been largely forgotten, buried as thoroughly as the victims once were. But there is one strange postscript to the story. In 1924, during construction of a new building on the site, workers excavating for the foundation reported hearing strange sounds at night, sounds they described as like birds screaming coming from the ground itself. The foreman dismissed it as imagination or perhaps the wind whistling through the construction site, but several workers refused to return to the job, insisting the place was cursed. The construction company changed its excavation methods, bringing in machinery that could work during daylight hours only. The project was completed, and the sounds were never reported again. But elderly residents of Savannah who remember that construction say the workers weren't imagining things. They say that on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is full, you can still hear echoes of those terrible screams. The peacocks remember, even if we have forgotten. The Marlowe case represents something deeply disturbing about antebellum Southern society, the way in which institutions of oppression enabled and concealed individual acts of monstrous evil. Augustus Marlowe was not just a murderer. He was a murderer protected by a legal and social system that refused to recognize his victims as human beings deserving of protection. In the decade between 1849 and 1859, 17 people died in that garden. 17 disappearances were reported to authorities, and not once did anyone in a position of power question the pattern. Not the city marshal, not the neighbors, not the other plantation owners. The system was designed to accept the loss of enslaved people as a routine cost of doing business. Runaways were expected, even normal. This institutional blindness wasn't unique to Savannah or even to the South. Similar cases have emerged from the historical record, though few as well documented as the Marlowe murders. In Louisiana, the LaLaurie Mansion case of 1834 revealed systematic torture and murder of enslaved people by a wealthy Creole socialite. In Kentucky, the workhouse case of 1856 documented the deaths of dozens of enslaved people in a supposedly humane correctional facility. In Virginia, the Briggs Plantation investigation of 1858 uncovered a mass grave containing an estimated 30 enslaved persons who had supposedly died of natural causes. But these cases only came to light through extraordinary circumstances: fires, Union occupation, rare courageous testimony by enslaved people who managed to escape. How many similar horrors never came to light? How many mass graves remain undiscovered on properties where manicured lawns now grow? The Marlowe case also reveals the psychological dimensions of power and dehumanization. Augustus Marlowe's private ledger suggests a man who had convinced himself he had the right to dispose of human lives as he saw fit. His cryptic notations, too curious, talked back, needed to be taught, demonstrate that he viewed his victims not as people but as problems to be solved, objects to be managed. This wasn't the fevered killing of a madman. It was calculated, methodical, and sustained over a decade. Marlowe maintained his social standing throughout this period. He attended church. He hosted dinner parties. He was considered a respectable member of Savannah's elite. The disconnect between his public persona and his private actions speaks to something terrifying about the human capacity for compartmentalization. The case had immediate legal implications during and after the Civil War. The military tribunal's decision to try Marlowe for crimes against humanity was cited in later proceedings against Confederate officers accused of atrocities. It established a precedent that certain crimes transcended the technicalities of legal property status, that human beings retained fundamental rights even when a corrupt legal system denied those rights. During Reconstruction, the Marlowe case was cited by radical Republicans arguing for aggressive federal intervention in the South and for the protection of freed people. The case became a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the slave system, not just the institution itself, but the way it had enabled individual acts of unspeakable cruelty. But the case was also used by Southern apologists to argue that the problem had been individual bad actors, not the system itself. If Marlowe was a monster, and they were forced to concede he was, then he was an aberration, they claimed. The sins of one man should not condemn an entire social order. This argument, specious as it was, found traction among those who wanted to minimize the systemic nature of slavery's cruelties. The Marlowe case also had an unexpected impact on animal welfare movements. The detail about the screaming peacocks captured public imagination in both North and South. Articles appeared in northern newspapers about the birds who mourned the murdered. Some early animal welfare advocates argued that even birds possessed a moral sense that recognized human suffering, a claim that likely overstated the case but reflected genuine horror at what had occurred. More broadly, the case contributed to the emerging understanding of trauma and psychological harm. Dinah's testimony about living in constant fear, about knowing that anyone could disappear at any moment, about the psychological torture of anticipating violence, this was some of the earliest documentation of what we would now recognize as the traumatic effects of living under a reign of terror. For the formerly enslaved people of Savannah and beyond, the Marlowe case confirmed what they had always known: the system was designed to destroy them, and their lives had been held in the hands of people who could kill them with impunity. The discovery of the mass grave and the subsequent trial were validating in a terrible way, proof that their fears had been justified, that the stories whispered in slave quarters about people who vanished had been true. The case also reveals the importance of witnesses and testimony. Without Dinah's survival and her willingness to testify, the full scope of Marlowe's crimes might never have been understood. Her courage in speaking publicly about what she had witnessed and experienced was extraordinary, particularly given the risks she faced even under Union occupation. Her testimony was preserved and later cited in congressional hearings about the conditions of enslaved people, contributing to the historical record in ways that transcended this single case. Today, historians studying the antebellum South and the lived experience of enslaved people consider the Marlowe case an important, if horrifying, window into the reality behind the mythology of the benevolent Southern plantation. It demolishes the fiction that slavery was a paternalistic system in which enslaved people were cared for as valuable property. Property that could be murdered and buried in a garden without consequence was not being cared for. It was being controlled through terror. The psychological legacy of cases like Marlowe's extends into contemporary discussions of systemic racism and institutional violence. The pattern of authorities ignoring clear warning signs, of communities practicing willful blindness to suffering, of legal systems that protect perpetrators rather than victims. These patterns did not end with slavery's abolition. They echo through Jim Crow lynchings that went uninvestigated, through police violence that goes unpunished, through institutional failures that continue to devalue certain lives. The screaming peacocks of the Marlowe estate serve as a metaphor for voices that warn of hidden horrors but go unheeded. How many warnings do we ignore today? How many patterns do we fail to question? How many mass graves, literal or figurative, lie beneath the manicured surfaces of our own communities? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are questions that the Marlowe case demands we ask. What do you think drove Augustus Marlowe to such calculated evil? Was he a product of a system that dehumanized others, or would he have been a killer regardless of the time and place he lived in? Leave your theories in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story affected you, and I know it's a heavy one, take a moment to think about the 17 people whose names we know and the countless others whose stories remain buried. History isn't just dates and battles, it's the human stories, especially the ones that were deliberately hidden. Subscribe to the Fear Abbey for more forgotten chapters of American history, the dark corners that textbooks skip over but that we need to remember. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Our community spans the globe, and I love seeing where this content reaches. Share this video with someone who appreciates real history, not sanitized mythology. These stories matter. These victims deserve to be remembered. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another lost chapter of American horror. Until then, remember, the past is never as far behind us as we'd like to believe. The Peacocks knew. They tried to tell us. We should have listened.